Right.
Richard Nelson, can you hear us? We're doing a mic check to see if you can hear the room.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Welcome this afternoon to our special meeting. And this is primarily set up as a work session. So we will not be making any votes, taking any votes. And we do have an agenda. As you can see, there is a consent agenda, a regular agenda, and then the work session. And we'll just go right into the regular agenda. The regular agenda is to ratify the commission's signature on the order to call for this meeting. Any questions to it?
No,
So this will be the only motion, I'm sure, that we'll take.
I have no other comments to make, so I can make a motion to adopt regular agenda number 1.
Right, I'll second that motion.
I got a motion and a second to ratify the signatures on regular agenda number 1. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That passes 3-0. Okay, number 2 then is our work session. The work session is regarding the 2022 Utah County budget for the general fund and other budgetary funds of Utah County. We set up preliminarily in our last commission meeting a couple of little parameters that we had in place. We started with $105 million as a general fund on the general fund money side. And then we had some discussions about what that meant with the work, with the program. What do you call that?
The schedule.
This salary study.
Salary study. Yeah.
The salary study. There was some discussion there. There was some discussion also with ANC. We did pass a few of the special service districts, but not. There was a couple others that we did not pass, and so I'm sure now we have the opportunity to go through. And I wanted to thank Rudy and Samantha for being available to help answer questions. We had a number of questions back and forth on all of them. I think there was one that I probably didn't quite get that one answer on, but anyway, we can work through that. We just kind of moved as if there was some money there that we had anticipated. With that, I'm not quite, since this is a work session, it's a little open, free and open for all the commissioners up here to talk openly back and forth. I'd like to hand you, if I could, and we worked up to this thing right to the last second. It seemed like Brian and I were going back and forth. This is the schedule that I had worked through. Want to make sure you have that.
See how it differs. Anywhere that it doesn't differ. Let's just.
And maybe to kind of show the big picture of that, not on the revenue side, but on the expense side. On the expense side, total expenditures was $107,982,650. That was, and that in that there's a couple things. It comes close to the little less than $606 million, but there was a $2 million transfer into potential inflationary options that may happen, and so that's how it gets us to the 107, which may materialize, may be needed, may not be needed. But it sits there as an option. So those are kind of the high level for me as I work down through this budget and trying to put it in place. Any other thoughts? Maybe high level thoughts?
I think high level we're pretty close. You said you were at 107 with 113 being kind of your total after taking into account other fund transfers. I mean, let's look at the details on that. But after my budget session that I had with Rudy and Sam on Friday, I was at 113 and 108. So we're within $1 million. So if we can just maybe go through and look to see where those differences are.
Revenue and expenses.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think I'm probably only about $1 million off from you on what I had put in my budget schedule. So if we can kind of go
revenue.
through the details and see where those are, we might be really quite close. Now,
Just
how much
below
did
the
you
108.
say? How much did?
Below the 108.
Yeah. Yeah. How much did you say you put in the inflationary fund?
2 million.
Okay. Is that what I had in mind? That's what
And
I had in mind.
is an inflationary fund actually needed? Can we just put that in general fund and pull from it as needed to address specific?
I had actually titled mine in inflation and innovation, and it's a restricted fund that would take a vote of 2 of the 3 commissioners that we can use as needed. And I put it in restricted because we'll only use it if the revenue surfaces, like if we end up having the revenue and if we end up having the needs. So it's very similar to what you're saying.
Yeah, it just seemed that if it was just in the general fund, it'd serve the same purpose.
And it is in the general fund. It is a general fund account.
It's a restricted line
It's
item
just
for.
restricted, and that way, if we restrict it, it can't, so it is part of the general fund money.
Yeah,
And then, as needed, let's say, for instance, fuel costs, we budgeted for 500,000, just a number. And it turns out that fuel costs go way up, and it turns out to be 600,000 or $700,000 in cost. We can come back and say, we didn't budget for that, but we do have a line item for unanticipated, core functions, because what do we do without the fuel, right?
Yeah.
So it's a
Right.
core function
Right.
that we're using, and we say we've got some money put aside, not knowing what's going to happen. We don't have to open up the budget because it's in the general fund, and we can just take that and put it in.
got it.
Right.
Got it. That works. I wondered about that. That's fine.
Yeah, and Ezra and I are just kind of working through the differences on R2, so we can look and see where those
Okay.
are. But we might be really close.
Okay. Okay.
As a perspective, I was looking at recorder fees, and I've talked to the recorder about this a few times, but most recently this past week. And they were anticipating roughly rounded numbers, 3.9 in personnel, 200 for other services, and internal funds was almost just over 900,000. But their revenue is going to be just under $8.5 million. When we subtract all that from it, what their actual cost will be, there's about not quite $3.4 million remaining. And I was considering that they were asking for a downturn fund. If they have another 2008, they don't want to lose people as they did back then. And they were requesting that we keep a year's worth of money aside. The past 2 years, I had asked, and I think, did I get this right, Rudy, that the recorder fees are in general fund? Is that correct? Or was there a separate line for that? And how much was it?
In the prior 2 years, initially there was a budgeted revenue from the recorder's fee in the general fund, but that was not actually in the final budget last year or for 21. And so we actually didn't have that in there. So there is, all of that money is sitting in 290.
Is it what, $12 million or something?
I'm sorry, for the revenues or for?
Yeah, for the past 2 or more years, there was the excess funds they had was put off to into a general fund or some other line that I'm not being able to fully identify.
Well, it rolled the fund balance. Once the year ends, any excess revenue over expenditures just rolls into fund balance in Fund 290.
Okay.
So it's sitting in there right now.
The recorders are asking then to that point about how much is it?
It's about 12.
12 million? Okay,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
And that includes revenues from 19, 20, and 21
okay.
Yeah.
that are over and above
It's
expenses.
split 8 and 4 is kind of how they have it split.
Yeah, since budget year 2019, all recorder fee revenue has gone into Fund 290, which is the assessing and collecting fund, but it is sort of siloed, if you will, between the recorder function specifically and then the ANC function more broadly, which is the assessor, treasurer, tax administration, and a few other functions.
Okay, because what they were asking since I've met with them over the past few months, if they could have up to a year's worth of emergency fund so they don't lose personnel like they did in 2008. And that would push it to roughly $4 million if we were to do that. And that was, I'm only throwing this out as a discussion item. And because if they have almost $3.4 million left over this current year, but you're counting this current year as part of that $12 million. Okay, so I'm going to discount this current year. I'll just, in my mind, go through with what I have. So roughly $8 million for 2020 and 2019. Is that palatable to take a year's worth or 6 months worth to augment?
Well, I think if you're going, are you saying on a worst case scenario, they lose all their employees? Because that's
Well, no,
gonna
not
happen.
all, but just to,
Is it a portion of that?
we didn't talk specifics on numbers.
If you have a year, if you're having a year, I mean, so
Yeah,
that makes a big difference,
yes.
right? Are you talking about a downturn where you're losing 10%?
Yeah, they lost,
8%,
they
or-
lost 10. Out of how many did you have originally? Do you remember, Lisa? So roughly a third, I think, didn't you? You lost about a third of your employees? Half? So if their personnel costs are roughly $4 million, if we could put $2 million aside as a restricted fund in case there's a downturn is what they're requesting.
And I think you have two options to do that. If you do nothing, those funds will remain in essentially a restricted fund balance that would be available for that purpose regardless. You would just need to amend the budget to appropriate any funds if you were going to use them in that particular year. The other option would be to actually appropriate funds to a restricted
As we're doing as we're doing with the inflation
Exactly.
piece.
Yep, and if you did that, then if you actually needed the funds, then you would be essentially just doing a funds transfer, which wouldn't necessarily require a full budget amendment. So those are two options to
Yeah, I would prefer the
accomplish
latter,
same
of
thing.
course, but yeah.
What I have in there is the monies that would have come out of the general fund to supplement the A&C, which is interesting because in talking with Rudy about that, sorry, I'm mixing that with the health department. So the those funds, which if we don't take it out of the general fund to supplement the A&C and just use that what was that, Brian? 3 point, what was that supplement number? A little over, it was 3 point something million dollars to go into the A&C, then, and you use the A&C's fund balance, 2.5. Yeah, 2.5. Again, I'm mixing the health department and the A&C. So the $2.5 million, if they take that out of their fund balance currently, to do it, then it doesn't come out of the general fund money.
Correct.
Yeah. And so, in ballpark numbers, if you take that 2.5 out of the 12 million that's in there, and however that's split back and forth, you'd probably still have more than that year you're talking about.
Yeah, because that would leave it rough, rounded down about $9 million in the fund.
Right.
Now, were you anticipating doing that in 2022?
Well, that would give us an opportunity to look at the tax levy.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
year.
Now, and I think the two things about having a reserve in there, I mean, the chances of it dropping that significantly in the first year are probably not huge. I mean, I don't think even if things went bad, you're still going to have things that are going to still be happening in the recorder's office. So, if you had $2 million or so, that's probably going to last you into the subsequent year as well. So I'm not concerned about one way or the other how we do that.
And the whole point is that if we had, in this case, at least half the staff covered, if there's a great collapse like in 2008 and they had to let go 10 people, then there's some way to retain some kind of savings account to offset their costs while we get out of the hole that we would be in. That's what they're asking.
Yeah, and that's why we have fund balance in there. So yeah, it's for
So
sure.
as we
For
did
sure,
with the
it's
inflation, could we maybe put $2 million aside for that event or that?
That's a really
request.
good idea, Commissioner, where within Fund 290, you could create a restricted appropriation to essentially a bucket, kind of like you're talking about the inflation specific to the recorder's office. And that would not be a problem, I don't think.
So what you're saying is, because roughly, there's $12.6 million in there currently. If you fund the 2.5 out of that, then you're down to $10 million. And if you're to turn right around and restrict out of that another $2 million to get to your point out of that, then you'd still have $8 million sitting in that account.
Yeah.
I mean, but the way I look at it is the recorder's office is funded out of the ANC, and if the fund balance is in the ANC, then wouldn't they continue getting funded?
So just to be clear, Fund 290 is collectively or colloquially called the Assessing and Collecting Fund.
Right.
But within Fund 290, there is a demarcation between recorder fee revenue and recorder fee operations. And that's separate from the ANC tax levy that then goes to fund the ANC functions, namely the treasurer's office and assessor's office. And so while there is a grand total fund balance of the fund, there's also a demarcation between the fund balance as to where it came from. Did it come from recorder fee revenue? Did it come from ANC tax revenue? And so, I think to Commissioner Lee's earlier point, any need for operational expenses in A&C that would exceed the anticipated tax revenue next year could be funded with the fund balance that came from A&C tax revenue. And then in the case of the recorder's office, if there's a concern about some need for additional funds or some reduction in revenues, you could just create a restricted appropriation. But yeah, to your point, if their operations were exceeding their revenues, there is fund balance to draw from. I think it's really just maybe a technical question about, do you want to set yourself up as a commission to have an amendment to the budget next year, or do you want to appropriate money now so that there can just be a transfer?
Yeah, my preference would be just have it identified and appropriated now. So it's there.
In anticipation of something.
Yeah,
possibly
of something,
happening.
yes.
Because you're right, there's about roughly an $8 million and a $4 million split in that separation that you're talking about. And so obviously the monies that would be transferred from the general fund that was in the tentative budget, that was going to go to the ANC would have to be split on that 8 and 4 million split difference. And then if you wanted if you wanted to put a $2 million restriction, then on the recorder side, you just put that $2 million restriction in
Directly in that one, yeah.
Yep. And to your point, you don't need to do the general fund subsidy, so to speak, this year, because you could just draw on the fund balance. And then you could look at the formula for 23 sometime next year,
Right.
based on how the revenues come in.
Right.
Yeah.
The second half of this would be on the recorder's fees. I was working off a document that said they had about 3.9 mil for personnel, but I'm told that might be higher than that.
Which one's this?
This is for the recorder's fees, their expenses. Oops, wrong page. There it is. Yeah, I've got, on this version that I have, if it's not incorrect, I've got 5.053 million for the total recorder expenditures. That would be 3.9 something for personnel. Internal service funds would be about 924,000, and then other material supplies, services, $196,860. Working off of that, I rounded up the personnel cost to $4 million.
I don't know, those numbers aren't matching.
Um,
I'm at 4.9 million.
So
3.9 for personnel,
3.9 per person,
Okay.
9 million.
and then
Okay.
there's internal service fund on
Okay.
top of that.
Okay, so a
Right.
total
So I
of
can see it.
4.9. Okay.
So is this, I'm off on this copy
you're
here?
right, you're
Is this correct? Yeah, because I've got the whole total about
Yeah,
$5,053,400.
that's, I've
Okay,
got that as well.
then that reads correct, okay. Looking at this, the state auditor came to see us, what was that, end of June? something like that. And then we got a memo from our civil division, Paul Jones, basically parroting what the state auditor said, and that is the fees should be used for things that are directly in support of the recorder or could be an indirect support of the recorder. And with that in mind, I was looking at other departments over the past few months as to what departments are supporting the recorder. And there's been some back and forth on who does what and how much they do it because this is all a new idea to them. But I narrowed it down to the surveyor, GIS, HR, auditor for finance, and clerk for tax assessing, for me at least. And in rounded numbers, I'm thinking that the remaining funds of the recorder's office, once we have taken care of all the expenses that are needed and necessary, and we've already now talked about setting aside monies for future downturns, and I actually subtracted that amount from this current year, so that should fit in there. We have roughly about $2 million left over. And I'm thinking in percentages, I have the surveyor for about 35%, the GIS 15%, HR 15%, auditor, finance 15%, and perhaps the clerk for tax assessing, collecting, that would be Bert Harvey, about another 15%. I've written over this too many times. So rough
Finance, 50%.
50%.
That's what you want to do. Yeah, you change it to 50%.
Yeah, but if this number up here, if that's correct, and I'm correcting myself because we were further refining this, and so we said 50% might go to surveyor. The guidance we received from both John Dougal, the state auditor, and the Paul Jones, our civil division, said it has to be reasonable. And trying to measure what they're doing, the day-to-day work, and if it's directly in support of the recorders or not. And so rounded numbers, we're looking at between 35 to 50% for the surveyor, 15% for the GIS, 15% for HR, 15% for auditor, and somewhere between 10 and or so percent for the clerk, for the tax admin. Yeah, tax recording, yeah. Yeah. So with that, looking at roughly, it could be out of this remaining $2 million, $1 million could go toward the surveyors, offset his normal costs from the general fund. GIS would be about $300,000. HR could also be $300,000. Auditor for finance department could be also 15% and about $300,000. And I'm wrestling with the clerk on the tax finance and
So-
admin.
One thing to keep in mind is if you're looking at the budget schedule for the recorder's office where there's an expenditure that is charges from internal service funds, one of those internal service funds is the Fund 680, which is the Administrative Services Internal Service Fund. And it's that fund, the Fund 680, that for every department in the county, recorder's office included, it funds things like HR, GIS, the auditor's office, civil division, basically all of those administrative functions that support from an overhead perspective all the operations in the county. The cost of all those the cost of those administrative services are then spread out among all the departments evenly.
And I think most of it's there already in the 680 fund.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so, in the case of the recorder's office, the recorder's office basically next year will be paying essentially about $1 million collectively for those services. So I don't know that you need to be concerned about any additional, use of revenues for those types of services. That doesn't necessarily get to the question about the surveyor. Tax administration is its own function within A&C for which we do collect property tax levy. I think perhaps the other part of the question is the degree to which other assessing and collecting functions serve the recorder's office. One way to think about it is what service does the recorder of a land deed, if you are the purchaser of a piece of property And it's in your interest as a property owner to ensure that your property right is protected by the recording of a document. To what degree is the treasurer's office or the assessor's office or the surveyor's office providing to you a service related to your recording of that
Right.
document? And I think that's where you have to kind of look and say, the assessing and collecting functions are called assessing and collecting because they exist to ensure that all of the government entities in the community are able to collect property taxes. And so we assess properties in order for the school district, primarily the school district, but the cities and the county to collect a property tax.
Just to inject though, but I didn't take into account the assessor because we had talked several times that he felt he's more of a consumer. He didn't
Right.
actually provide any
That's
support
right.
to the recorder.
Yeah, exactly. You spot on. Most of the assessing collecting functions are actually being served by the recorder's office as opposed to serving the recorder's office. So the people who record a land deed aren't receiving a service from the treasurer's office or from the assessor's office or from the tax administration office. However, those offices certainly are receiving service from the recorder's office. So in a way, the operations of the recorder's office today sort of subsidize the operations of those offices. So if anything, they should pay the recorder's office. But we don't do that. We don't need to do that necessarily. But even there's a nexus between their operations, but that's where I think the idea of what services are being delivered by the payment of the recording fee. That's really the issue.
Yes, and the departments that directly support, and as you point out, it's nearly it's 924,000 is what I count that the recorder fees are going toward the 680 fund. I recognize that, but I would like to perhaps augment that amount. And that's what I wanted to at least talk to the commissioners about at this point.
So let me understand, do you have is there a dollar amount that you wanted to do? I mean, I didn't do that in my proposed budget. I figured that this has got some more questions that need to be answered, even probably on a legislative basis. I know that there are other counties that do it differently than we do, but is there a dollar amount that you're saying that needs to be pulled out of that just for conversation purposes to?
I was looking at what is their total gross overhead requirements, personnel, internal service fund, other, and we have roughly $2 million left over. And should we augment the internal service funds, these other 5 departments I mentioned,
Oh, I see.
or they're still?
Yeah, and I think that would, I think to that point there, it becomes problematic on the internal service side.
Right.
Because it's not directly linked. I think it would be a lot safer to link it where it's at least closer, but I would not feel comfortable going that route.
I'm sorry,
on
what
the
do you mean it's
on
not
the-
directly linked?
Well, internal service fund for the different departments, because that fee doesn't necessarily go for that. I don't see the tie in that to the internal service fund.
Yeah, I mean, they're already spending nearly $1 million in the internal service fund that is directly
Correct,
correlated.
yes, about 924,000, yes.
Yeah, if you assessed an additional amount in addition to the internal service fund assessment, then that could be construed as a double payment, a double charge for those same services, and that would be inappropriate.
Yes, I was looking to augment the internal service funds, yes.
Right.
The point is, it's already being
It's already
provided
being
with those
assessed,
service
but-
and funded through the internal service fund. So if you add an additional assessment on top of that, that could be a double payment for the same service.
Not necessarily, I hear what you're saying. I was looking to modify what they're currently paying. Let me put it that way.
Perhaps the thing to do is just to study next, because keep in mind this one thing, when you adopt the budget, today, tomorrow, in a few weeks for the year 2022, you're not necessarily saying what will happen. You're saying what you're planning on happening. And you often will have to amend the budget in the year 2022 to sort of true up the realities of actual expenses and revenues. Perhaps we could undertake a little bit of a study on the way the internal fund for administrative services is charged out and maybe look specifically at the recorder's office and kind of get a better idea of how specifically recorder office operations are triggering expenses and services from those administrative services, and just to make sure that the formula it really works out and that they're paying the right amount. And you wouldn't have to finalize that adoption of let's say a changed fee amount until the end of next year as you kind of adopt a true up. And so I think to your point, nothing would preclude you from kind of looking into that between now and the end of next year. And if there is a change in the nature of the level of service, you can adjust that formula accordingly. So.
Okay. Okay. From my conversation, it just seemed like it might be short on that, but maybe and that's just, of course, conversations, and the state auditor should give, something that's reasonable. And so that's what my approach was. There is no history that we can map all this to, and so that was his guidance to work that from.
Well, and I think the surveyor's office has given us some reasonable numbers that could tie back. That are a lot more that seem really, to me, they seem reasonable in the way of a tie back. Some of those
In the
fees.
existing internal service funds?
No,
or-
I'm talking about not in the internal service fund. I'm talking about the work that they do that could go back to support what the recorder's fees are collected for.
Yes, and that's why I was trying to look at augmenting
Yeah.
the surveyors and all these other departments, what they're currently receiving, just augment that, modify that, not necessarily double as you're.
Yeah, I need to clarify, for instance, if the surveyor's office, that's a service that's not included in the internal service fund. So to the extent there's a legitimate allocation there, that would be appropriate because it would not be a double charge there.
Right.
The others that aren't in the fund he's talking about, or any of these others. that
Okay.
aren't there.
I think that's it for now on that particular one.
Just wondering if any of these are not also included in the current internal. Okay.
Okay. So I'll point out with the health department. So we talked about the recorder's fees excuse me, with the A&C. With the health department, there's also a fund balance in the health department, and so there was an attentive budget, some movement for money to go and augment that as well. I pulled that out, and they've got $8 or $9 million in their fund balance as well, which typically comes back to us anyway. And I think this will give us, if we ask them to go ahead and use their fund balance to continue their operations, we'll see how that works out with the numbers this next year, because this next year we'll hopefully be able to true up some of the real costs that are in.
And that should impact the need for the nursing? There
Well,
was like 2.7.
Which nursing? Are you talking about the grant funded with the pandemic or the school nursing?
They were asking, I believe the school nursing, I forgot what the percentage is from the school districts to offset that cost. But it was a $2.7 million that they had requested for nursing. An increase.
And the nursing ones, I mean, I have that
That
in
could-
here, but they'll pay for it out of their.
That could come out of their fund balance.
Out of their fund balance.
Which they have 8 million of, okay.
Yeah, so on that one, was it Monday of last week? Being a short week, I have to think through it. On Monday of last week, we had a Board of Health meeting, and I actually brought up the fund balance, and I talked about that we as a Board of Health don't really have a plan for that fund balance, and that we need to. And I actually brought this up, that, we're continuing to ask for subsidies from the county, but yet we have a fund balance that we continue to put into the fund balance, and there isn't a long-term plan for that. I could see us as a county supplementing if, for example, that fund balance was being built up to look for building another location in Saratoga Springs as the population grows. But there isn't any sort of plan for that fund balance right now. So I think it's a good move this year to ask them to use fund balance to cover their operations. And then the Board of Health is considering putting together a committee to look at, if we have a fund balance, what are our future needs over the next 5, 10, 20 years? And do we need to be building up a fund balance for that? But in the meantime, there isn't a plan like that in place. So I think that makes sense. Yep. And then next year, that will give the Board of Health time to develop a plan. And And then if they have reason for us to continue to subsidize them in the future, that makes sense. If not,
Yeah.
that's what the fund balance is for. So I think that's a logical move. I can support that.
Okay.
As can I, yes.
Okay. Maybe I'll just bounce right back up to revenues, on the revenue side. And I kept the property tax at the 56,450. That's pretty stable. I think we can anticipate that. That does have new growth anticipated into it, which, I mean, it's going to be close, right? We're usually pretty close on those. And then the local option sales tax at the 2.750 million. That one I kept the same. On the county portion one, I did reduce that $2 million from 46 to 44. There's always the anticipation that can go higher. We don't know, and so with that one, I kind of pulled that one back with kind of an understanding. If you look at the revenues and expenses, you'll find that we're hoping, and this is knock on wood, cross our fingers, things that the sales tax goes in a direction that possibly it could. And if it does, then I would anticipate that we would drop the remainder of that we don't have budgeted back into our fund balance as we prepare for the future for things like the North County building, which I would love to follow the Washington County's model, where they drop money into their fund balance year after year and then paid for that primarily with cash instead of going to a bond. I think that would be advantageous for us to do that, is to build that up as we are now. I mean, our fund balance is about 35 million now, and we're anticipating dropping another 10 to 15 million dollars into that. So there's a good healthy chunk there for us to look at as we move forward. That's not all liquid. We know that there's some ties to it. It sounds big, but there's that. So that would bring us then, of course, other revenues, which would be $9 million in there too. And I think to your point, Commissioner, and I didn't have a chance to really look through this, but I took it as note that there are revenue sources that we don't necessarily hold the line to. I think we should. I really do. I've thought about that for years. What happens when a department projects revenue like this, and then at say $1 million, and it comes in at 500,000? Well, that becomes a double hit to the budget in a lot of ways. And so I didn't have time nor the energy, frankly, to go back and look at all of the revenue sources and then tie them maybe on a more quarterly basis to see where they're at. But that's how I'd anticipate something like that would work. And that we could say, if you're hitting your projected numbers, then these flow into your budgets. If they're not hitting those numbers, then they maybe get reduced according to what the reductions look like as we flow through the year. I don't know if that's what you were looking at.
Well, and
but-
it was originally, and it was just an idea that I had thrown out there, and we continue to improve every year. We could look towards that for the future. I mean, that was something that I thought of like a week and a half ago. Right. And there just wasn't time for us to pivot on that, nor the budget team, but that is something that we could look at in the future.
But it is a $9 million other revenues that are put in there, which brings us, to $112 million dollars. And so you'll see the difference in the one that I'm proposing anyway, with 107.9 versus that 112. Of course, that excess would drop straight to a fund balance in the end. So that's kind of the revenue side. Of how I put it together. I don't know where you want to go from here. If you want to go look on the staffing side.
Yeah,
or
let's look
where-
on the staffing side, because I think as far as revenue projections go, I can agree with you 100% on everything that you put down.
Okay.
And and I'm not opposed to having the ANC and Health Department using their deficits coming out of their fund balance instead of the general fund. So all of that, I would agree with 100% and say I'm fine going with your proposal on those aspects. So let's look at staffing plan.
So you're projecting roughly about 8.5%, 9% increase over last year's budget overall with this 112. Does that work about right? If we don't include the 7.5 and that we put aside in CARES, we had about 98.9 million in our budget. So we're looking
That's
at.
on the
That's
revenue.
revenue side.
That's on the revenue
right
side,
But we're
yes.
looking
Yeah,
at
revenue
roughly
side,
the
not the
same,
budget
we're
side.
looking at about roughly 9% increase on the revenue side.
On the revenue side.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then on the staffing side, the overall my overall philosophy was over the years, I found that we had an increase in like the attorney's office. The attorney's office had an increase. This year, in looking at general fund money and everything, there's nothing in there. It's pretty flatlined. We also, the clerk auditor's office over the last couple of years has increased, and so there's been some increases in there. We've had some in the surveyor's office. They've hired some as well, and they're flatlined this year as well on it. We've got the health department, which a lot of that's grants, and so a lot of times when we look at that, it's interesting how that looks. It looks like there's a full-time increase, but in a lot of cases it's not. And so it kind of flatlined. And so as I looked at the different departments as we're kind of moving through the years and funding and not funding, the one that I gave a little higher priority to was the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department was down over those years. Last year, I think we held them to 1 or 2 positions. And so this year, in looking at the funding, there was some positions, not all of the ones that they had in there, but I tried to keep it within the numbers that we have with that 107 million, and of course, funding different levels. And so the ones that I kept in for new, and these are full time, is I kept 1 full-time employee in under marriage license and passports. I kept 2 in the justice clerks from clerk 1. And then, let's see, we go to, and we have in the corrections, there were 8 in corrections that were kept there. I did actually list them. This is an increase, and I listed them as restricted because there's been quite a bit of discussion on corrections, and mental health and substance abuse are both in the jail. We know they're in there, and so I put a restriction underneath those eight employees as we find a way to properly handle the mental health aspect of the jail. So it has a restriction for more consideration and conversation. Also in the sheriff's, there was 2 corrections for booking deputies, and then 1 additional for the SVU detective position. Support service judicial was 1. That's the lieutenant for the emergency services. 1 was in there for an increase to senior office specialist from the 3/4 time to the full time. That was one that we dealt with this year, and they put it in here to keep that going as a full time individual. And then we have in the in the health department, there's a number of them in there. Of course, a lot of these are grant funded. There's 1 in there that was for vital records. Yeah, that's right, vital records. There's a bunch in there that were in there for environmental health, but again these are all grant now, grant funded. There's another one for nursing. There's a bunch in nursing that were continued for grant funded. Bunch of those. And then CJC, there was 1 for assistant clinic coordinator salary. There's another 1 for an assistant clinical coordinator benefits. And then in the assessor's office, there was reclassification for 4 vacant staffing plans, a reclassification for the staffing plan position, appraiser, trainer, or evaluation managers. in the A&C stuff, and then there's a career ladder adjustment in there as well. So the assessor then, on that one, there's some increases there. And then there was one for a new lead. This is a programmer for IT, and another programmer. There's 4 programmers, 2 support for the cybersecurity positions, and those were the ones that I had put in there as the. Is there another? Did I miss one?
No.
Yeah. Oh, so just a total, if you want that. New positions that I put into the budget I have is 1 for the clerk auditors, 2 for the justice court, 13 for the sheriff's office, 2 for health, 2 for justice court, and 6 for information systems.
What made you put for sheriff again?
13.
13. Okay. I note that on that tab, salary and benefits, the sheriff says he didn't actually prioritize those. So we meant to follow up with that. He told me that this morning. So
Prioritize.
there's a priority number
okay.
assigned to each one.
Yeah.
He handed me some other forms that are not here, but basically it follows what you're talking about. What I was going to suggest is that maybe the priority piece isn't necessary, but the point of what you're bringing out is the positions. There's 13 positions that you're mentioning.
I did see some priority position.
Yeah,
I saw 'em.
on this
Yeah,
one
I did
here,
too.
Oh, which ones are you talking about?
this one here, that's the paper copy you have there.
I see
Priority column?
priority on all of them.
Yeah,
What he's saying is
They're
the
not
sheriff
in
didn't.
order.
no,
the
no,
sheriff
but
didn't put the priority down.
So somebody
Somebody
else.
else.
yeah.
Oh,
Now, I mean,
That's-
he can move positions within his staffing
Yes,
plan.
yes.
So if he had a different priority for one of those positions, he's
can
well
do it.
within his ability to reprioritize, to change those around.
Yeah.
As long as it stays within his staffing plan budget, he could move those around with Ralph, and all they have to do is inform us as the commission. So if, for example, if you funded one that wasn't his priority and another one was, he could swap that. So that's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, in visiting with the sheriff and his team, they told me that one has to do with the mental health piece that they're addressing. Those 8 positions they wanted. They have 4. Each person works 12-hour shifts, so they have basically every other day or so many days, and they have breaks. And the 8 would then augment that, allow them to have more of a break in between. But he and Jurgen, the health department, Wasatch Behavioral Health, are in communication and have been working for some time now together to address the mental health issues in the jail. But what is necessary that we might need to take to our state representatives is that we do need additional facilities and staffing in addition to what we have here in Provo. And that's down the road, I know that, but it's simply to bring that up now that we need to look at bring that up to our legislative body in the coming weeks and months to help us address this.
yeah. You know, I have some strong feelings on this, and they're unfortunate. I spent a conference back in D.C. that was very disheartening. We as a country have moved our mental health and our state hospitals basically from care and facilities onto the ER and into the streets.
Yes.
And into the jails. And it just blows my mind that we're doing that. In some cases with substance abuse, not always. Sometimes they medically need to be treated to get off. But in some cases, they can be in the jail and go through a withdrawal process, however painful or whatever that's like, and maybe be able to change. But on a mental health side, you cannot do that. You can't just starve it out of them. That is just not how it happens. There has to be there's a different level in there. And I'm not saying that that's what the jail does, because I know they do try to treat, and there's some that's on
Behavioral
there.
health is working that, yes.
And
Yeah.
you know, and Jurgen's in there as well, and they're the experts when it comes to mental health. I would really like to see us take that money, which was about $800,000, and let's do something that can actually turn that needle somehow on mental health when we're talking about in the hospital, because I just think that they dive and they'll continue to dive without, medications, counseling, and see if we can turn that. Because unfortunately, I would prefer not to do it in the jail. I think that's the wrong place. But that it is what it is, and we're going to have to deal with it the way that the cards are dealt to us. We don't have a facility. If we had a transitional place in between, I think that would be the best spot. But we just don't have that transitional spot in between, and so we have to deal with it. And I'd like to have that conversation with the sheriff, with Wasatch Behavioral Health, with ourselves and others, and find something that's innovative and new that we can move forward with. Let's try something different, because the old pattern seems to be not working as well.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that that's addressing the mental health is a huge thing that we need to do. I know that we offer services through Wasatch Behavioral Health that I think have a greater success rate. I know that we offer rehab programs for mothers that are addicted, where they can bring their kids with them, and there's daycare while they're in the treatment facilities.
Yeah.
Right? That a mother's biggest motivation to get off of drugs is her children. And if we put her in jail, we separate her from her motivation. If we can treat her in a facility where she can bring her children, then she has her reminder and her motivation with her. And I think that makes a huge difference. So I think we absolutely need to look at those transition programs and working on mental health. And the more we can do that in our jail, it's not only not compassionate to those who suffer from mental health to put them in the prisons, but it's also not fair to our staff in the prisons, because they are not mental health professionals and they're being forced to act as them. And so I think that it's the best thing for our staff to have. I think it's the best thing for the sheriff's staff. It's the best thing for those that are suffering from mental health. I see it as a win-win. Plus, I think it'll reduce recidivism significantly.
Yeah, and those 8 corrections added to for the mental health will help. The deputies are there because they have to be there 12-hour days, and there's no recourse for them except to hear the reactions of the mental health people that are there. So I can see that.
Yeah.
That was crucial.
Okay. So looking at your staffing plan, there's a couple of areas that I think that I funded a little bit differently than you. I'm glad to see the addition from IT for the programmers and the cybersecurity. I think that makes a lot of sense, particularly as we start looking for innovative solutions to some of our personnel issues, like not being able to find enough people in the recorder's office or the assessor's office. We're going to definitely need programmers to try to do integration there so that we can find technology to find those solutions. And obviously the cybersecurity ones are beyond necessary. But looking at, I noticed that in marriage license and passports, you only approved one position, but they were looking for several more. I think this kind of goes back to the same discussion that we had around the recorder's office. People are paying for a service in that office. In 2020, we gave 10,700 marriage licenses. We've done over 12,000 marriage licenses this year. We're looking in 2 years of over a 40% increase in marriage licenses. In 2019, when I came into office as the clerk, we did not perform marriages in Utah County. It was not a service we offered. We've performed almost 3,000 marriage ceremonies this year. These are fee services. These are not being supplemented by the general fund. The positions that they have asked for are to continue to serve, and also the passports. We have become the #1 provider of passports in Utah County. We are the #1 provider in the county for passports. We perform over 3,000 marriages, and we've increased marriage licenses by 40%. The people that they have asked for are in direct response to that, and they actually have fee revenue to pay for it. And so I think that this is one of those areas where I think that the workload is there, and it's not coming out of the general fund. They literally pay a fee for those services, and those services should be offered. I know that we do have a 4.9 star rating on Google, but one of our 1-star ratings was a person who had booked a marriage ceremony, and because there was someone that was sick, no one came on to perform that marriage ceremony because we don't have enough people in the office. So when one person is sick, that means people's marriages aren't happening. And that's not acceptable because they've paid a fee for that service. And since they definitely have enough fee revenue, I think their fee revenue this year will be over $600,000 on marriage licenses alone, not to mention marriage ceremonies and passport revenue. Josh, you can give us some maybe updated numbers. I don't have as updated, but.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I want to largely be here as a resource from the budgeting perspective as the auditor's office. I don't know if other departments were going to come and comment about specific requests. If that's appropriate, then I'd be happy to comment. Maybe.
No, I'm just asking comments on the numbers of performed. Like how many marriage ceremonies have performed? How much revenue have you collected?
The way to look at it is really on a revenue basis. So right now we're on track this year to collect $1.3 million in revenue. And our budget ask in terms of expenses for next year is less than 1.3 million. It may be the case that when Commissioner Lee was talking about positions, he might have been talking about asks for new full-time positions, which we only had one ask for one new full-time position. I don't know if Commissioner Lee had a chance to weigh into some of the other types of requests that might be staffing related, but not full-time positions. Because to your point that you were talking about the need for more staffing, the bulk of the labor we're asking for, in addition to the one full-time position, would be some recharacterizations or reclassifications of some existing positions with an additional ask for time-limited labor. And to your point, yes, it's very much high tempo in terms of operations. We anticipated this year in 2022, originally bringing in somewhere in the neighborhood of $600,000 to $1 million in revenue. Like I said, we're on track for 1.3 million. We've exceeded even the updated revenue projections that we gave at the beginning of this year. And our expense ask next year is still well below what I think our projections is, but it is very much in response to demand. To your point about the high level of services, one of the things that's been really great about that office is we're now open evenings and weekends, which is really helpful for people in the community that can't get a passport during the traditional 8 to 5. And so that's a really awesome service that the county is now providing.
Right, and they pay for that service, so it's not being supplemented by taxpayers.
Exactly. Yep.
So I don't know if your numbers included that, but I didn't see that. And so I did notice that your numbers were a little low on those areas, but where those are fee paid for services, I think that they should be funded this year, especially since the ask is still projected well below this year's revenue.
Yeah, I had the one full-time, to your point, the one full-time that was in there. And then the moving of the public service team lead to the public service supervisor. I put a no on that one. That was a $25,000 one. And then also I have a no on is a full complement. It was kind of confusing on this one to kind of figure it out, but there was a full complement of time limited staff. I think that turned out to be about $54,000. Not quite sure. And then there was an overtime allocation, I think, for $11,000 that was in there.
Yeah. So, yeah, once again, I would argue, especially, for example, with the moving team leads to supervisors, how many people do you have working in that office right now?
About 15 time limited at
So plus full-time and time limited.
let me run the numbers.
Okay. The reason I bring that up is we have one supervisor in that office. One supervisor for like 25 people. That's
Full-time.
Total full-time, 1, 2,
6. I think I thought of 6, but there may be more.
5, 6. Yeah.
6. So that's 21 people being supervised by one person. And that's not efficient. Plus that one person really he has a hard time doing all the executive functions of that office when he's spending all of his time managing that. I mean, 26 people for one supervisor is a little high. So these would be entry-level supervisor positions, allowing a more senior supervisor to spend his time on
So are you saying
executive.
that the one supervisor that you're proposing though, when I read through it, it looked like it was going to supervise one person?
No, we have essentially one director or one manager over the entire office and no other supervisory staff. And so what we would do is take two people who are currently functioning as team leads and make them shift supervisors, because now we're open 8 to 7 p.m., well, 7:30 p.m. and even on Saturdays. And just the tempo and the operations of that office and the degree to which we have time-limited staff, we need those positions to truly be, well, at the end of the day, they're performing supervisory functions, but they're not actually classified as supervisors. That's a bit of a problem. And so that's where that ask for those reclassifications came in. And then the time-limited budget is really important as well, because we're anticipating, just based on operational need, to have that kind of a time-limited resource. Our approach to time-limited staff, or really what could just be called part-time labor, is that if you hire somebody on a part-time basis, then you can staff up or down based on the needs and the demand. And so our commitment is that we will continue to staff the office based on the demand from the public. If the demand from the public drops, in which case revenue would drop, we're going to drop the shifts and the amount of labor that's being used from a part-time basis. So really what we're asking for in the budget is the authorization to spend up to a certain amount for part-time labor. But my commitment is that we're only going to spend that amount of time if the demand is there and the service is there and the revenue's there. And
I mean, I wasn't taking out the time limited. I mean, there's still $225,000 in there for time limited.
great. Yep.
So it's not like that's
Right, and what I'm
zeroed
telling
out.
you is, we have 40% more work, and he's asked for $50,000 more dollars. So
Yeah.
he's got 40% more work and 25% more.
If you look at just the finances, starting in, let's say, 2019, if you compare 2019 to today, the net revenue that office generates has gone up 5 times, so 5,000% in terms of net revenue. So from about $30,000 a year net revenue, upwards of $700,000 net revenue for what we're anticipated for this year. So really, this is just a function of the demand for those services. I don't want to have to reopen the budget next year and say, oh, we need more authorization for time limited. So,
Right.
yeah.
And I really don't like the idea of saying, I'm sorry, we can't book your wedding ceremony because we don't have enough people working. Especially when that brings us revenue as a county. I think the purpose of doing it through time-limited revenue, like Josh said, the reason we started down that path was because then we're not adding merit employees that we can't get rid of if we don't have the workflow. Doing it through time-limited budget allows us to hire part-time people, so that if for some reason that were to fall off a cliff, then we could just let people go, because we would just not schedule them for shifts because we wouldn't have that. So I think in that area, those positions that they've asked for, they have more than enough revenue to cover them. It's a fee service. That's literally what the money is supposed to legally be used for. And we have the demand from the public. And they're doing a good job, because, I mean, give me another government office that has a 4.9 star rating on Google, right? I think that would also be one that we could toy with this idea that we had talked about, where we put the money in restricted, and if the revenue is there, then they can hire the people. And if the revenue is not there, we couldn't. So like, for example, it could be like maybe through June, right? Like come June, when we do the mid-year budget adjustment, if the money is there, then we take it out of restricted.
Yep, that works for us as well. The only reason the ask for time limited might appear high is because we're just anticipating the upper limit. There's some things happening with the demand for that type of service, which could really generate a lot more activity next year. We don't want to be caught flat-footed. We want to be able to hire part-time labor as needed.
So it could be you would be fine with us putting in restricted?
Yep.
And then just coming, because restricted, you wouldn't have to open the budget. You would just
have to
basically
amend
come
the
to a
budget.
commission meeting and with a
For a
resolution.
transfer. Yep.
And do a transfer.
Exactly.
I'd be fine with that too, right? So it becomes restricted, and then they have to ask, and then they have to prove that there's revenue before they get it.
So on the overtime, tell me about that. I mean, unfortunately, we didn't have this conversation
Yeah,
during our
sure.
normal process with all the other
Yeah,
departments.
the overtime
So-
is when full-time staff end up having to work extra because demand has gone
They're
up.
on
And we've-
salary?
Yep, and we've seen that happen. Well, no, they're hourly. So, the 6 people we talked about that are full-time in that office, most of them are hourly. And if they have to work in excess of the typical hours, then they have to be paid overtime, typically. We don't always authorize overtime. It really depends on kind of the needs and if it's sort of just kind of an emergency and, we really need them versus it's maybe more, we could do like, what do you call it? Comp time. But from an accounting perspective, the cost to the county is the same because that comp time still gets registered as on our books as a liability. So from a cost perspective, it doesn't really matter. But that's where overtime comes in, is when full-time hourly staff have to work more than they would traditionally be scheduled for. And that can happen from time to time.
So, we moved on a management basis to go open early, stay late, and then shift the people so that we wouldn't run into this problem with
No,
overtime.
it's not about the shift. It's not about the time that they're
you're
working.
open, you're still open,
Sure.
right? So if you're coming
Yeah.
to the end of your shift, you could transition to the next person if they were coming on.
Yeah, that's not, so the overtime isn't used simply because we're open late. The overtime historically has been used simply because of the demand for total amount of work that has to be done. And the people who come in the evening that work on a shift basis, those are part-time people. They're not being paid overtime because they're part-time. So they're not going to end up in an overtime bucket. These are our full-time career service sort of tenured staff that get leaned on in times, to Amelia's earlier point, if somebody's sick, somebody's out of the office, if we're understaffed. Now we start to lean on full-time career service staff who typically just work 40 hours a week, but because of the demand in the office, they might get leaned on to work more hours. And that's where overtime comes into play.
Yeah, I think we touched on that last week. Was it 2 shift supervisors?
Yes.
Okay, that you wanted to change from the limited or part-time
team
to
lead, yeah.
team lead.
So if we hold the numbers the same, then what other department are you taking them from? Because you can't have. So where's the decrease coming from?
The main difference is the sheriff's department.
Yeah, I had funded the sheriff's department a little bit less than you had funded the sheriff's
Is
department.
that what you're doing? Okay.
For the marriages, though, they wouldn't be necessary to offset another department because it's all self-funded. So it should be able to be a zero effect on other departments.
Yes, that's correct, except that what you just revealed is that our revenue is subsidizing the general fund.
Yeah.
So the marriage license office is currently subsidizing the general fund to some degree because we're producing net revenue above and beyond the total expenses.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Which, to the point that when I was clerk auditor, I did receive an email from the state auditor's office letting me know that they've noticed that marriage license continues to supplement the general fund and that hopefully our expenses come in line with our revenues or we're going to have to adjust our fees.
Yeah, I've heard other counties do the same thing, and yet they've been doing it for years. There's been no pushback on that by the
Well, it's because there
state.
was the Utah State Supreme Court, the decision that came down was a recent decision. So just because someone's been doing something for years doesn't mean it's right.
Right.
And the difference too is like when we talk about the recorder's office, the office of the recorder is not a general fund activity. But issuing a marriage license actually is a general fund activity. And it goes to whether or not the nature of the service is a general government service. So in the statute, it basically says, the county clerk shall issue marriage licenses. And of course, you can charge a fee to defray the cost of that. You could also not charge a fee, and you could just charge property taxes to pay for that. But it's a general government service, whereas the recorder's office, there has actually a statutory prescribed fee amount, right?
Yes, it's just the emphasis last June was that it was called rule of fees. And so to me, I know it's general fund, but to me, the marriage license would be a
Right.
rule of fee constrained item
Yeah.
too.
As well as passports, as well as performing a marriage. So one of the things that I did is I took a lot of the equipment requests from the sheriff's department, and I funded those out of the equipment replacement fund, so they're not being funded out of the general fund. And that could make up the difference in that amount. You know how much that was?
But if it's self-sufficient, we may not need to offset elsewhere.
And I think my budget was a couple $100,000 more than yours as well. So that could have been where the difference was as well. So what I had done is I had taken several of the equipment requests from the sheriff's department and I had funded them out of the equipment replacement fund. And then my budget was a couple $100,000 more than yours.
So the equipment replacement fund, which I think we were trying, I mean, of note, there was a $200,000 one from motor pool that we're trying to get funded this year.
Right.
And then there was another one, and I can't remember his top off the top of my head. There was another one in there too. Oh, health department. No, it was, well, health department, we're gonna let their fund balance.
We're gonna let their fund balance do it.
Yeah.
But,
Just to note, neither one of those you just mentioned would be in the equipment replacement fund because the $200,000 is actually in motor pool. And the other one that we're talking about, the computers for the health department, that's in information systems. So it's a separate fund, but we are advocating paying
For
for
this year.
this year, yes.
so some of the things that I had put in there, for example, was the request for gym equipment. I know that like under COVID, gyms were closed, but we want our first responders to be able to stay physically fit as part of their job. And so we had looked at replacing some equipment in case gym shutdowns happen again. And I had looked at funding those, for example, through the equipment replacement fund. I had also looked at funding, I went through and funded basically like every type of non-lethal force that they requested, like the cannons, the pepper spray cannons and things, and all of that I had put in equipment replacement fund. So some of the things that I funded through there, I funded through equipment replacement, and that would have offset several $100,000, which is less than what I think this additional ask from the auditor's office is. And that could have been the difference.
Do you have a list or do you have a schedule? Or-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we could see your the kind of personnel overtime, internal service fund, capital equipment,
We can compare the two
that
and
model.
see where
we can
we're.
compare the two and see.
Yeah.
The only other one,
We would request that you maybe provide us with one also because we're trying to keep a tally of all these things so we
okay,
can.
so you want us to send you ours and then
And
then Commissioner Lee as well?
and Commissioner Sakovic. Yeah.
So the other thing that I had noticed is that you didn't fund any of the additional positions in elections. And in 2019, we asked for 2 additional positions in elections. We were given 1. In 2020, we asked for 2 additional positions. We were given 1. For the last 2 years, the federal government has subsidized our elections through ARPA and COVID. And I think it's time we start paying for our own elections. I also think that it would be irresponsible not to fund an election security person, considering our environment. In the past, we made up for it using time-limited funds. And the problem with the time-limited funds is that these people cannot work more than 20 hours a week, and so you have high turnover. But with the nature of elections today, we need to not have high turnover in that area because the more turnover you have, the higher the security risk is. And so elections asked for 2 positions this year. 1, which is the same one that has been asked for since 2019, 2020, 2021, and now in 2022. For the 4th year in a row, they're asking for a position. We have actually covered that position with time-limited dollars for 4 years. It's time to actually make it a permanent position, considering that we've shown for 4 years through municipal cycles, presidential cycles, and midterm cycles that it's necessary. It's obviously needed, and it's a higher risk to have it not be a full-time position. The second position I asked for was a specific security position because of the nature of elections and as they are getting more scrutiny. So I would fund both of those positions as well.
What would the security do? We talked about that briefly last week. Would they just be physically present to ensure that the process for collecting, opening, and counting and recording the ballots are maintained appropriately?
Yeah, so from an election security standpoint, there's a whole host of obligations and things that have to be managed and taken care of that is specific to election management. And we just don't have the full-time personnel to say, Joe on the team, 50% of your job is election security. We don't have that bandwidth because right now we're at 100% bandwidth just, maintaining the voter registration database, which is very labor intensive with processing changes to registrations. So that's where that staffing ask comes in is we need to build the succession planning within our team so that we can confidently train people with specific roles and obligations. They can go and get different certifications and they can, become able to sort of maintain our systems and operate our systems. You can't rely on part-time people to do that kind of thing. I can't take a part-time person and,
But you have been, according to what you're saying.
Well,
You have been allowing that to happen.
Right.
Well,
So part of the part-time.
largely just hasn't been
Part of the
Right. A lot of
part-time
it is it just
funding.
hasn't been happening.
Yeah.
What about the part of the part-time funding for offsetting the full-time funding?
So what happens is we end up using all of our part-time labor to do the things that only part-time people can do. And but then the problem is we get new and additional kinds of here's an example. It used to be that we would spend $20,000 to $40,000 a year contracting with our election vendor to actually program our ballots. So we can theoretically do that in-house, but you have to have somebody trained to do that in-house. So you need 2 or 3 people that are trained to do that so that you have some redundancy built in. Well, I don't have 2 to 3 people that I can choose from to do that because of the size of our staff. So we don't have enough staff to really build in redundancy where we can confidently in-house, we sort of in-source certain skill sets.
Right. And that's $40,000 that you're not paying to the vendor.
Right.
Which would go towards the salary. Like $40,000 a year that we've been paying to a vendor to do something that we could do in-house and makes it more secure. The other part of that is that in 2019, it was the smallest election we're ever going to run. It's a municipal year with no mayors on the ballot. Okay. And we had $50,000 in time limited labor, and that worked. But in 2020, we spent almost $200,000 in CARES Act money on time limited labor. In 2021, we had 2 full-time CARES Act people. Those CARES Act dollars are leaving, and so is the money that goes with them. So we have had these positions. We've just been relying on the federal government to pay for them. And we're going to lose that money moving forward. And so we need to start paying for our own elections.
Okay.
And they're not high level positions. They're more just average staff level positions, right? They're not supervisors. They're not team leads. They're just average staff.
Yeah, this is entry level positions within the election space, which allows us to really train, cross train, build redundancy. The nature of how we do elections is a lot more intensive on the skilled labor side and less on the less skilled labor side. You know, an election of yesteryear, you could just hire a bunch of people temporarily on a part-time basis to come in for a day or two. And now we really rely on sort of subject matter experts that have to have experience and certification and be trained on various complex systems. And it's hard to do that when you don't have redundancy to build that in because the elections team is largely entry level and mid level, and you're going to get turnover. You're going to lose people, and then to sort of get new people, you end up in a real problem not having that redundancy.
So the question I have is in 2020, under elections, it was $2.1 million. 2021 was $1.7 million. And of course, 2020 is a presidential election, which is the big one. And in 2022, it's $3.3 million. So we're going to be going almost more than $1 million over a presidential election year.
Yeah, and a big part of that is your internal service fund. So previously in 2020, it wasn't portioned out, and so that's going to be an element of that. And you're going to see that in all.
We
of
also
your general
spent
fund
$2.5 million in 2020, but the rest of it was federal dollars. We spent almost $400,000 in state and federal funding.
So that would take you to 2.5.
Right, with
Right.
no internal service fund. And then how much of that is internal service fund? Do you know?
520.
I have to look at the 2020.
Well, your internal
500, Ezra says it's
it's
522,000.
522, and in 2022
So that would bring us-
was 285 and 251 in 2020. So there's a 222. $100,000 difference.
Well, we didn't do the internal service fund in 2020.
Yeah, so the 2020 charges from internal service was 250, whereas in 22 it's supposed to be 522. So there's a big increase there. I think in 2020 we also were able to lean on a federal and a national grant program to fund a portion of one of our positions. Moreover, to the point about COVID funding, which we used for some positions as well. So I think that's where the big difference comes in.
Well, in 2020, we also had the state government paying for the Super Tuesday presidential election.
Right.
We had HAVA money that we got, plus
Yep.
we had CARES Act money from both the county and CARES Act money from the state. Plus there was additional HAVA money from the federal government. Plus we've received the grant from the Zuckerberg Foundation and from Tusk Philanthropies. So I think it was probably closer to $3 million now.
Yeah, and that's where you
see.
see that difference in other material supplies and service, where in 2020 it was 897. I think, our 22 proposals, almost 1.5 million. Some of that is mailings related to redistricting. A lot of that is actually maintenance and service charges related to a lot of our systems, which the state picked up that money in 19 and 20. And we're going to have to now bear the full cost of that as well.
That was equipment too. I mean, the state was purchasing equipment.
They
Yeah,
purchased the
but
equipment,
that
but the
was-
service fees. They purchased the
Right.
service fees in 19 and 20.
There's
but they're
annual
not paying for the
licensing,
service
maintenance,
fees.
and service fees
But the bulk
related
of it
to
was equipment.
Right.
Right.
And what you see is-
It's important because the equipment comes with ongoing maintenance charges and licensing charges. So you buy a machine for whatever, $100,000, and it's an ongoing $10,000 a year service and maintenance cost. And so in the first couple of years, we were able to use the state money to both purchase it and to defray the ongoing costs. But that's also going
So,
away.
yeah, and the state money was one-time money, so we purposefully, when we purchased the machines, we purposefully built into the contract as many years service fees as we could, like software licensing fees, so that we could defray that cost as long as possible. And it's catching up.
Yeah, the other thing that I wanted to point out to keep in mind here, that when you talk about the money that was funded by the state and all those things, predominantly that's in Fund 248. And so it didn't show up in the general fund, it was in the grants fund, because we had grant revenue and grant expenditures. So with those grants not being there, 100% of that cost is now coming into the general fund to, cover whatever we need to cover.
The 467 grant fund you're anticipating for this year, is that state or is that federal or both?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
That's-
when we talk about federal grant, they're often passed through the state, so we access the money through the state.
Pass through?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so the source of the funds are, there's been three main sources: the federal government, the state government, and sort of national foundations.
And you're anticipating that being significantly lower?
Yeah.
By how much?
Upwards of, so in 2019 we got $1 million. We got 3 to 4 million from the state. In 2020 we got another 5 to 600,000 from the state for the Super Tuesday and for COVID related election costs. And then you think about the degree to which in 2020 we defrayed some of our county election costs with county COVID money. That's separate from national COVID money that went through the state specifically to elections. And then the national foundations, we probably got, over $250,000 in 2020. We don't anticipate any of that. We basically anticipate next year receiving no new state money. There might be some reimbursement for some of our systems. I wouldn't anticipate that would be more than an additional $100,000
So you're only anticipating about $100,000 in
of
grants for
new
next
money.
year?
Yeah, next year.
How much of continued money?
Well, continuing money would be like carryover, like any leftover money, which that's old revenue. We would only spend it if we had new equipment that we needed to buy. But in the budget ask that we have, none of our expenses are new equipment. So if we had a new piece of machinery, for example, that we needed next year, we would exhaust any existing grant money that we have to buy that equipment. Next year's budget ask is really operational, but it includes ongoing licensing and maintenance and service costs that are from all of our various equipment vendors, in addition to staffing costs that can't be defrayed with grant money.
Okay.
So we had paid for, when we bought the equipment, we paid for 3 years up front, right? 19, 20, and 21. Is that why, and that's why this is all hitting in 22?
Yep.
So I think, and I don't think we could negotiate more than 3 years with the purchase. I think we tried.
Okay. Do you have others?
I think, was there any?
Those are the big ones?
Those were the big ones. And then I just want to double check. We're just double checking. We did have one position in wildland fire that you didn't fund, but that was it.
Okay.
So the one in wildland fire, and those were the only other ones I had. But I had all the programmers. You had all the programmers. I had, the 8 for the mental health in the jail. You had all those. And then, like I said, that was I think that was the difference in our budgets, whereas mine was about $1 million more. Remember I said that in the beginning? And I think that $1 million comes down to the wildland fire, elections, and the auditor's office.
Okay. Commissioner?
Yeah, I see the wildland fires on both the budget and this worksheet that for wildland, for personnel is $895, and in the worksheet it has just we basically cut that in half. But does this include personnel and all the operational costs?
Not sure what
That
your
first page, under sheriff, wildland fire. Proposed department requests for 452, department requests, and tentative was 338. Proposed amount by this one right here, Brian. Show them right that one.
Are you looking at enforcement or wildland?
Wildland fire. Yeah, because I see an increase on the overall ask about 323,000.
If I may, just look and see what we're looking at here.
So this one right here. And here's this one over here. Wildland fire is right there.
Yeah, so it's related to that. To the
Yeah.
wildland
Can I
fire
answer
right
anything
there.
with this, commissioners?
Yeah, we'll see. Hang on a second.
Yeah. Well, I think you can ask the additional position. Will you outline the positions that you asked
Yeah,
for in
that's general
wildland
fund,
fire?
so
Yes.
And
Where-
also whether they will bring us revenue? Because that was my assumption, is that they would bring us additional revenue because you could hire them out.
That's correct. I asked for 4 in total, 4 captains. 2 were for in-county, and they were supposed to be through the general fund. 2 were for out-of-county or the resource program that would be on the road and going out and bringing in revenue. That being said, even with the general fund ones, we still, when the opportunity arises, can bill for their services within Utah County. So
Okay.
that is not all the time, but
some of the time.
Some of the time. So if we're
Okay.
on a federal fire or a state fire, after a certain amount of time, because of our paperwork, we get to start billing for our equipment and personnel on those fires.
So do you know which ones you listed as funding, Commissioner Lee?
So
I think you
on,
had some of them.
I've got,
So you'd asked for 4, 2 internal, 2 external.
I removed
Yes.
the 2 merit full-time fire captains in county operations.
So those are the ones
Those
you
were,
didn't fund?
those I did not fund.
Okay.
Priority-
And I think I funded one of those.
Yeah, that was a priority 3.
Whatever priority 3 was.
Okay, I think
Yeah,
that's right.
priority
Right.
3, yeah.
Do you know with your priority, with the external were higher priority?
I don't know that. That was in the sheriff's.
Okay.
General fund one.
Is a general fund one? Okay, so I had funded 3 and you just funded 2. So I had funded one of the internal ones.
Yeah, and 15.
That was the difference.
16. This is kind of.
So 2 and 2.
No, I know that
And
we
there was
ran,
wildland fire on
we
this one,
ran some
too.
numbers on your external operations.
Correct.
And do you remember what the revenues beyond expenses were on the external operations?
Again, that's a year to year. Right now, in total, since they've started the program, I think we're at like 1.6, not including 2021.
Okay, so 1.6 additional revenues beyond expenses for the external.
Correct.
So it is supplementing the in-county operations.
I
That's
believe
what it's
Right.
intended to do, is to supplement. Yeah.
Do we know,
And it should pay completely for itself.
Right, it
It
does,
does.
and then an additional
And then
supplement.
supplement,
Okay.
you know,
I think we've been in, if you will, with the resource program has been around for about 15 years. And out of that 15 years, I think there was 2. I'd have to go look at my sheet that we didn't do it. And except for that, it's always been in the
Okay.
positive. I think last year we gave back in the positive 470,000.
Okay,
Was just in 2020. This year, we're looking at probably 250 to 300. Again, that I can't give you an exact number right now. I wish I could, but we are definitely in the positive over what we've used out of that account.
okay,
the question usually comes in, at what level does the out-of-county supplement the in-county? And if it, you know, going back to if it's a revenue producer, then at what level does that need to supplement inside
Right.
before we say, let's continue to go further with it or add on to it?
right.
And that's the question usually.
Commissioner, I would say it 100% supplements and helps because you have these people that are in county when they're not on the road to help fight fires here. So
So we have
again,
trained people and equipment when they're not on the road.
exactly, and we're using them within Utah County to be able to suppress the fires, to be able to help on other aspects throughout the county.
That makes sense. So anyway, that's the only difference there is that I had funded 3 of the 4 and we both funded the external and then I funded 1 of the general fund.
And what I'm concerned too is the 4 diesels, the F-350 and the 3500, those are about pushing 18 years old, I'm told. Is that correct?
So what that is
not
those are
fund the
different. I think that's what I asked for, an additional request.
Okay.
So I have an F-150 right now that's not recapped and for some reason never was.
catch.
I have
So
a
if they, you know,
Duramax that's not recapped, and I have an F-250 just gas that's not recapped. And the reason we're kind of jumping from gas to diesel is just pulling the chippers, pulling all the heavy equipment.
Okay.
Going out and doing project work to take care of the dangerous fuel throughout the county. I just looked at something a little more robust to be able to pull this equipment up Woodland Hills Drive, up Provo Canyon and places like that. So those additional asks, if that's what you're talking about, the reason I went to diesels was just to be able, 1, because those 3 vehicles were never in recap for some odd reason. And number 2, just to be able to get the equipment around and not have so much wear and tear on an engine.
Yeah.
And I think on those vehicles,
and the-
I put 1 in recap in the 2021 budget adjustment and then no on the other, just because we didn't have the funding.
Because I think they're both about 18 years old or so. That's why if I got that
You know how
right.
old yours is? Is it
I
a
don't think they're out.
2016?
So
So
it's only.
Which one's that?
the F-150, I think I'd have to go back and look, but the other 2 I think are close to 18
Yeah,
years
I've got
old.
an F-350 and then the 3500, the
Yeah,
Ford and the
okay.
Ram. So the 350 is only 2
No,
years
that
old?
was like a 150 that's not on recap.
Okay,
and I
it's
think
not
that's
on
the
here
one
at
you were
all.
talking about.
Yeah,
I wanted
that's,
to put it
that's a
on
different
recap.
thing.
Yeah.
It's not on this list, okay.
Yes, you were looking at the Dodge and the
goes on-
Ford 1-tons, right?
You recapitalize that, would you recapitalize that with out-of-county funds? You know, to recapitalize that, or are you talking about
Yep.
general fund money to recapitalize that?
I was
that
just
we
going to
have?
recap it out of the end of the year budget adjustment. So it would end up being general funds,
Yeah.
is what it would end up being.
We don't have an existing
We could
recap line
recap
for
it
this,
out
do we?
of county.
No.
We
What?
could recap it out of county.
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to keep that tight as much as possible.
And
That's
just,
a possibility.
just one thing to remember, I mean, I think when I came to my proposal with, I remember you were in there. The hard thing with Utah County Fires, we have 3 divisions under one group. And that's the hard, because when we start talking about this and kind of diving into it, I always hear, well, we just want to hear it's in the out of county, or we just want to hear it's in the in county, or just the prevention program. But the problem is, my fire department is all of
Right,
that.
when you've got a
It
fire, you
jumps
just send
around
people.
and goes here
Right.
and goes here and does this. So I would just ask that you keep that in mind for the fact that I would love to be able to say, yeah, this is just for the resource program,
Right.
but we might use it in county on a resource fire.
Right.
So it's kind of that hard.
Well, I would rather you use everything on in-county fires
Yeah,
so that we get the max benefit as the citizens of this county.
right.
And then you charge the max amount when you're out of the county. That's
I
my
like the way you
preference.
think. Yeah.
Abs-
Anything else, commissioners?
Yeah, that's interesting, because on the tentative budget, those vehicle ones were left at nose from Rudy's budget. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And I
Okay,
just,
thank you.
and I included
Thank you.
one on the
Thank you.
recap.
We only funded 1 position. Doesn't
Yeah.
make sense.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
So I think that was.
Any others?
That was,
I think
those were
those
the
are the-
major.
those are the big ones.
I saw differences in our budget.
So you need some stuff from us. We need some stuff from you so we can look down through it.
Right.
And then Commissioner Sakovic, if you've got some of the budget ones that you talked about, now that we've had this discussion, if you can get those to us, and we'll get the other. Oh, you got that one from me, but if you need more, I can give you more on some of the stuff we have.
So, okay. Should be done.
Okay.
We voted on this Wednesday. We only have tomorrow.
I
to
would
get it
I would
wrapped up.
assume. Yeah, we have to get them quick
So just,
today.
So as we're just finished running the numbers, ours are only $200,000 off.
Yeah, let's take a look
All
at
said and done. Yeah.
see where that's at now that we've had this.
Yeah, and because he went through and
Discussion.
made adjustments for like the health department and the A&C fund that we had talked about, adjusting revenues.
Yeah.
And once we did that, we're about 200,000 off. And so my guess is it comes between the sheriff's
there's
department and the
just
auditor
and
and the
forth on
elections.
some of it.
That's it.
Okay.
Where it boils down
So it's
to.
basically, it comes down to those three departments.
Well, if you've got
And
that,
it's only a
especially if
difference
you've
of
got it lined out, it'd be easy to
200,000.
see
So
if
you're
you've got
showing a
separate.
big fund balance, a contribution to fund balance.
Yeah.
Like over 400.
Yeah, because we looked at your numbers and I agreed with that, so he adjusted my schedule. So he adjusted my
okay.
schedule for the fund balance, the A&C, the health department, and the revenues. So we're all good there. So then once it came down to, it's basically the auditor's department, the sheriff's department, wildland fire being part of that. And then, and that's it. So we're like literally within $200,000.
And if we can get copies of all that, we will actually, like I said earlier, we have.
distribute that to everyone.
We can put all of the pieces together and summarize for each one of your proposals, and they'll be right side by side. So we
So
can,
we possibly could have 3 proposals out there for Wednesday.
yeah, potentially, but what we could do, we could take the three, what all of you are all looking at, and we can get that summarized so you can look at it and compare them.
Well, I
Could you
think
could you just condense it to show us what's different? Because if we agree, let's just.
Yeah, and I think we can do
Well,
that.
I would like to see what you have, and that way because I might be able to modify and adjust.
Yeah.
Besides sending it in there and having them modify and adjust.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
No.
so we can
Yeah,
just
we
send you
can-
yours first and
Yeah,
then we can send it
get
to
them
you.
back and
Okay.
forth, and then we can give the proposals in.
Okay.
That'd be
Yeah.
That
great.
works.
And the same with yours too.
Yeah.
If we can just modify.
So
and
try to
adjust.
get something to you noonish
I
tomorrow.
think we can probably
Get this
give ours
massaged.
over tonight, maybe.
can get ours
I'm putting you on the spot.
Probably. I think yeah.
Well, we can
We'll just need the topics. but
Okay, yeah.
I think everyone-
Well, we probably can, I mean, the sense of giving it to the other commissioners, we can do that tonight.
Yeah.
Yes.
But getting
Yeah.
it to you, it's
Yeah.
gonna take
Tomorrow.
tomorrow.
We can get it to you tomorrow.
Well, as long
We
as,
can get it to them tonight.
yeah, as long as it's in a good format, then we can work with that. That should be fine.
Mine's in the Ezra format, and
we're-
his is in the
we're doing
Brian
it.
format, so we're good.
Yeah, we're
You
working
don't
off
have to deal with our
this.
format. You're dealing with their format.
And we-
We're working off of this format, which is the one that you sent to us.
Yeah, okay,
The most recent one that
yeah.
Sam
Okay,
sent.
sounds good.
And you don't have any changes since then? Okay. That was like, I can't remember if it was Tuesday night or Wednesday.
We did just discover one change. There was something happened in the salary and benefits, $100,000 in the surveyor's office was understated. So that is one
Just one
change.
line,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Not sprinkled throughout.
No,
In their salaries and benefits?
it didn't
Okay.
come through
Not
right
in the survey.
when we did the conversions coming in, from HR to our system or whatever, something happened and a digit was dropped on one of the salaries. So
Okay. Well,
I think it
need a
was good.
final motion then.
Move to adjourn.
I will second that motion.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We're now adjourned.
That was super productive. We can easily get there. Yeah, we're super close. Yeah, looking at yours, I was like, sweet. Goodbye.
Share this with Tom. I haven't had a chance to show you guys both, but so what I did was I said, okay,